regardless of my academic title, I also did a lot of work in Toronto with LGBT youth, which is Supporting Our Youth was one of the organizations that I worked with for many years, and also Trans Youth. So I want to introduce our panelists today, which is the first panel is titled, so it's called Queering Caribbean History, Immigration, and Diasporic Politics. So here we really kind of think about linking activism with politics and also with academic work. So to the extreme right, we have the privilege of having Maurice Tomlinson. So I'm not going to read the whole bio, but just a little bit so you get to know about the individual that's going to be talking today. So Maurice Tomlinson is a Jamaican attorney and senior policy analyst with the Canadian HIV/AIDS Legal Network. And at the Legal Network, Tomlinson collaborates with local groups to challenge anti-LGBT laws and practices in the Caribbean. He also acts as a counsel to claimants. To the left of Maurice, we have Mohamed. And so Mohamed is a pioneering Indo-Caribbean Muslim gay rights activist, native of Guyana, who currently resides in Richmond Hill, New York. And on the eve of 2013 Manhattan Pride Parade, Amin and his siblings were attacked for being members of the LGBTQ community in their Southeast Queens neighborhood. So in response to this, Amin started the Caribbean Equality Project, and he's collaborated with Ryan to make this amazing day for us. So thank you so very much. And to the left of Amin, we have Ryan Persadie, who's amazing in terms of Tifa Wine. So Ryan is a PhD student in Women and Gender Studies Institute, and Ryan is exceptional. He holds a MA in Ethnomusicology and Sexual Diversity Studies from U of T, and also a teacher. Graduated as a teacher candidate from OAZ. And Ryan kind of looks at SOCA in his research. And to the left of Ryan is my colleague, Dr. Beverly Bain, who teaches in the Women and Gender Studies program, Historical Studies at the University of Toronto. And Beverly has been an activist in Toronto for many, many years, and across different feminist movements and so forth. She currently teaches researches in the area of Caribbean and Black diasporic sexualities, Black and Caribbean queer feminist organizing, sexual assault, and violence against women, gender and colonialism, transnationalism, and anti-capitalism. And Beverly has published a number of articles and book chapters. So welcome all of you to this panel today. So I think what we will be doing is starting first with just, I guess Maurice, we're going to be doing about 3 minutes to 5 minutes of discussion, and then I'll take some questions, and then we'll have a conversation. Let's think about it as a conversation today.
Great. So thank you all for coming, and thanks to the Caribbean Equality Project for this excellent symposium. As was said, my name is Maurice Tomlinson, and I work with the Canadian HIV/AIDS Legal Network, and I've taken the liberty of handing out these packages which summarize my work, so I won't have to go into much detail. I work in the Caribbean, although I'm based in Canada. I started this work when I was in Jamaica, and I brought it with me to Canada, and I've continued to do that. And this involves working on decriminalization. So we have cases now in Jamaica and Barbados. We're challenging anti-sodomy laws in both countries. Working with religious leaders to try and encourage a more progressive, approach to LGBT rights. And we were able last year to host the first ever conference on the church and decriminalization. And I'm very proud to say that this November 5, we'll be hosting the book launch of the compendium of the presentations from that conference. And it's going to be in Toronto, so it's here, hopefully, as in many of you. We're also working with the diaspora groups to get them to support the liberation efforts back home. So, for example, we brought David up, we brought people from Grenada, Belize, we had Jason over last year, to get them to help their compatriots to get excited about the liberation prospects that are happening in their home countries. We're also supporting homeless shelters, because we're not only concerned about policy, we're concerned about people. We're trying to encourage investment in homeless LGBT shelters in the Caribbean, and they're sadly not enough, and the few that are there aren't very well supported. And we're trying to do police LGBT sensitivity training, because we know that for any society to warm to the idea of LGBT people, we have to be visible, right? People fear what they don't know. And until they see us as their sons, their daughters, their doctors, their pastors, whatever, they'll still believe the rhetoric that we're all pedophiles, etc., etc. But for us to be visible, there has to be safety. And so this is what we're trying to do, to encourage the police to respond to the violations. As Jason described, many times the police knee-jerk reaction is to blame us for our own victimization. We've had 7 of these trainings across the Caribbean. Hopefully more will come. And we're trying to also build the capacity of groups in the Caribbean that are working on LGBT liberation. So help them to document and to report and to also present to international fora like the UN. I've helped to author reports to the UN and to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. At the end, the hope is that we can mobilize the LGBT community from and in the Caribbean to champion our own liberation. We don't need, as I've said before, we don't need salvation. We need support, right? And so, as a Jamaican Canadian, the emphasis is deliberate. I'm trying to leverage what I can here to encourage and to support the work back home. Oh, how could I forget? We also have done Pride. We have organized Montego Bay Pride and Barbados Pride, and I'm very proud to say that this year we're having our 4th installment of Montego Bay Pride. Where's Theo? Our 4th installment of Montego Bay Pride, and this year we're going to be having our first LGBT walk for rights. Not quite a march. We're going to be walking. We also have a film festival and a panel discussion, very excellent panel discussion. We started getting death threats for these. We reported them to the police. Thankfully, the venue for the panel discussion and film festival is right across from a police station. Hopefully that will discourage any kind of reaction. So watch this space. So Montego Bay Pride is October 8 to 14. So thank you, and I'm very proud to be here and be on this panel.
This is my turn, right? So I wanted to talk a little bit about, folks have been asking, what do you do and how did you start the Caribbean Equality Project? And that's a very personal story. About 5 years ago, my partner and I, we attended a cooking competition in Richmond Hill, Queens. And, everyone knows a curry duck competition, queer folks love to cook curry duck as well. And my partner happens to be a really good cook, and he entered. And in that space, we thought it was a safe space for us. I lived like 10 minutes away from it, but it quickly became homophobic. The MC verbally announced that the gays are in the building. It created a very hostile environment. And the drummers, the Tassa drummers that were there, started using verbal slurs at us. In response, we tried to de-escalate the situation, but then they became even more aggressive. And it quickly became physical among our group and the drummers. So, instruments that are meant to echo culture were actually used as weapons against us. And from that incident, my brother, who will perform later on, was injured. There was a legal case behind it, and eventually the case was dismissed. But the trauma that LGBTQ folks face on a daily basis, when we talk about visibility, when we talk about pride, and when we talk about our culture, safety is also a challenge for many of us. Whether it's about being on social media, being proud and being queer at a symposium such as this, or being in a photo with folks who are out and queer. And from that incident, we've learned that not everyone is an ally. Our own community, they're not an ally to who we are. And my brother got injured. It took about a year for us to really heal from that situation. At the time, my parents were in Guyana on vacation. They did not know any of this happened. We were scared, literally in the hospital, trying to figure out how do we tell our parents that one of us is in the hospital. And we didn't. But that same day, they found out on the news that their child was in the hospital. So I'm really honored to say that my mom is here today. So sorry. But it took us almost 2 years to heal from that trauma. And at the time, in New York City, there was no organization that focused on Caribbean LGBTQ identities. There was no organization that focused on healing and education and immigration. And out of that tragedy, out of that sadness, out of that came the Caribbean Equality Project. Today, we are the only educational-based Caribbean LGBTQ agency in New York City. Our launch, Mr. Maurice Tomlinson was there as our keynote speaker. And as we flew from New York to come to Canada, he flew from Canada to New York to be our keynote. And we wanted to create this symposium after Ryan reached out to us to really focus on identity, focus on our queer Afro identity and our queer Indo identity. But this conference in itself represents what the Caribbean Equality Project does in New York City. Our work is grounded in community building. As an organizer and an activist sitting here among academics, our work means nothing if our community is not uplifted. It means nothing if there's no safety in our community. And there's so much that we can learn from our community to sustain our work as well. And I'm so honored to be on this panel.
My name is Ryan. I'm really excited that this is happening because this has been a year in the making with CEP, so I'm like, oh my god, we're finally here. I'm a PhD student in the Women and Gender Studies Institute, working with two amazing feminist Caribbean scholars, Cassandra and Alyssa Chotz. And I work on queer Indo-Caribbean diaspora, Soca Fet culture, politics of belonging, citizenship, and discourse of pride, all those sorts of things. This conference really came about because when I was doing fieldwork in Toronto during my master's, I was looking at the politics of belonging among queer Afro and Indo-Caribbean gay men who navigate belonging in Soca Fets, right? But what I found was through looking at these spaces, there wasn't this, what I was calling this reciprocal recognition of both identities coming together. And so spaces were either crafted through blackness, or they were crafted through a South Asianness or through a Desiness. And as an Indo-Caribbean person that doesn't identify as South Asian, because our relationship with India and South Asianness is very complicated, I kind of reached out to CP because their organization was built on this togetherness, this unity, and fostering these conversations together. Right? So, yeah, so that's kind of what I'm about, and I'm Dr. Bain.
Hi, I'm Beverly. Hi. Thank you to the organizers for this, and lovely to see you all, and thank you to all of you for being here. Let me start by saying that I came to academia very late in life. I've been an activist for 40 years in this city and continue to be an activist, a feminist, queer activist, but a feminist also anti-capitalist, anti-colonial activist. I started when I first came to Canada 41 years ago. The first people I met on the street, I remember asking my mom, where are all the black folks in this city, right? And she said, they're all at Bathurst. And I remember going to Bathurst, and the first people that I ran into were Makeda Silvera, Dion Brand. They were on the street, and they were actually distributing leaflets. And that's when that's how my political activism began here in Toronto. One of the things that was clear at that moment, because this was in the 70s, was what was happening in this city in terms of police violence with respect to black folks. A couple of black men were already shot by police. There were also the ongoing racist discrimination that women were facing. And I'm telling the story in the sense that the women who were on the street were black lesbians. They were the ones who opened those spaces because, we're talking about breaking silences. And one of the things that we need to also be clear is that black lesbian and black queer women actually paved the way for a lot of activism and queer lives in that city. Rivera was the first woman to create a house, a safe house for lesbians and gay men in this city. Gay black men, Caribbean, and they were primarily people from the Caribbean who were lesbians and gay black men who couldn't stay in their homes because they came out and they were not accepted by the fact that they came out and had to find a home, a space, a safe space. Michaela Silvera provided that house for them to actually be safe. It was in that house that a lot of activism started. We had the Black Women's Collective, we had ZAMI, we had other organizations started by gay men. It was in that house that all of these struggles germinated, that came to the forefront, that is now, part what we know as Black Cap. It was men from that era who created those spaces so that many of us in this city can actually be safe. And again, I'm saying this story because my politics is intersectional. I'm a feminist. I have been an activist in the feminist movement, but I will say that black feminist lesbians have been in every movement in this city. It was black lesbian feminists who created Lokarama. Okay? Let us all be clear in terms of the role that women have played in creating spaces for queer, black, and brown folks in this city. Right? And I remember not only did we create political spaces that were about politics, but it was also spaces with music and culture. We can think about people like, women like Nick Red, like, Verlia, or sisters from the Asian subcontinent, like Vashti. All of these people who created spaces for us to be safe. I even remember, and I will identify Leslie Lecan, who actually was really involved in space creation at the Red Spot. And Leslie is a queer Trini, right? So there were all of these lesbians who created spaces for us to be safe in this city, because in this city too, we couldn't belong to the larger queer movement, right? We couldn't find spaces in those movements because of racism, right? That made itself very evident at Pride in a couple years ago, right? When we sought to make those connections between race and class, that there was no space for blackness, there was no space for those of us who were also women leading that struggle. So I think it's really critical for us to actually start pulling all of these pieces together as we go through the day. So I wanted to leave you with that to start with. I'm sure we will.
So thank you, all of you, for kind of your initial thoughts and kind of taking up Beverly's thread, thinking historically. So there's a couple of things that I think that have come up around how do we make links between Afro-Asian relations, Caribbean relations? Like, how do we think about that? And how do we look back at what has been done, right? So, based on the many different spaces that we occupy, can you guys speak a little bit about that in terms of the kind of work that you have done in terms of kind of bridging those gaps?
I'll go first. A more present answer to that would be breaking silences. What this symposium represents for our community is bridging that gap, right? And I'm looking at the audience and I'm seeing beautiful black and brown bodies, black and brown Caribbean bodies. And I always say, when it comes to activism, our voices needs to be uplifted, and we need to create spaces, just as Beverly said, right? We need to create those spaces, and if we don't do it, no one else will for us. And in New York City, that's what the Caribbean Quality Project does. And working with folks here in Toronto, we wanted to make sure that our community come together so we could share our history. And thank you, Dr. Beverly, for uplifting that as well. We need to share our history in order for us to be not only visible, but heard.
Yeah, I was just going to say, what I want to acknowledge too is that a lot of the queer spaces that have been crafted in the city have been through Black queer movements that the Indo-Caribbean community needs to acknowledge. Because there is a lot of anti-Blackness in the Indo-Caribbean community that has been perpetuated time and time again. But that community has been the one that has allowed us to be part of those communities. So I just want to acknowledge that, because where I found community first coming out, and I say coming out because my parents don't even know. I've never told my parents that I'm gay, even though it's kind of like, oh, you're a little different, And my mom, even last week, my mom found me, she goes, where are you going? I said, somewhere. I don't know. But yes, she goes, where I want some too. Yeah. No, but I just want to acknowledge that, because when I started doing this work, I was looking for Indo-Caribbean spaces that didn't exist, right? But I did find community in these queer Silk-fed spaces that I went to, and to push this further is I want to see a queer-fed space where chutney music is played, and we're all getting on Bata Drupati together, right? I want to see a space where bachata and dancehall and reggae and soca and chutney soca are all together in a space, because I haven't found that yet. But there is one tonight, so y'all should come. But again, pushing that we're not just in the nightlife community, but in our diasporic centers, coming together to kind of recognize that we all have differences in our identities and our identity politics, but we all share this rootedness to the land, right? And again, we need to acknowledge the queer Black movements that have made space for us in their communities.
I think for me, borders don't mean anything. I like to say my advocacy isn't defined by my geography. And I am primarily concerned with ensuring that diaspora, queer, Caribbean people see the work that's going on in their homeland as their work too. And not just in one island, but all the territories. All the territories share the same history of oppression, and we need to, as a people, invest, support, align ourselves with that liberation struggle. So that's one of the reasons I have been trying to bring up persons or Skype in people who are actually on the ground doing work, so that we can dialogue with our people here in Toronto about what is needed, what's the best kind of support. Because there tends to be this, there are some, and I'm not going to say all, there are some who will go back and deliberately seek out workers and activists and people who are doing, creating change, and try to align themselves and support. But for large majority, sadly, we come to Canada and we view the Caribbean as somewhere we vacation or somewhere we go home to eat nice roti and ackee and saltfish. But the investment in our homeland, in creating this safe space for ourselves, not only in Canada but also in our homeland, gets lost somewhere. And for me, that's very troubling. I want us to continue to see that borders mean nothing, right? we are always Caribbean first, no matter how long we've resided on this land here. We're always Caribbean. At least that's how we're viewed, and I think that's where our navel strings bury, as we say in Jamaica. We should see that as an important part of our work as well.
I just want to say, in terms of what I have experienced is, in terms of the work, and I just want to actually really give a shout out to the activists in the Caribbean in terms of the everyday work that they do. Because for many of us who come here, some of us and many of us continue to do certain kinds of work with the assumption that that work isn't happening on the ground. I'll be clear and say that Jones's victory is also relative to the work that was already going on the ground, right? That work never stopped. That work continued and continued and continued. We saw what happened. We saw the work that was happening in Trinidad. We saw the work that is happening in Jamaica. We see the work that is happening in Barbados, in Belize, etc. That these activists continue to work. Many of us go and we come, but those people stay. And they continue to be exposed in particular kinds of ways as they do this work, right? Some of us, those of us who have had to come, we had to come. But there are others who are also openly doing this work, even against all odds, in spite of the backlash, and in spite of the attacks, in spite of the violence. And a lot of the victories that we see today must be, must be seen in context of the ongoing work on the ground. So I just wanted to say that.
Another question I had that came to mind is really thinking, discourse that there's no borders, but we look that they exist, right? In terms of in a real sense, for people who can't move,
right.
And I think what kind of also I see happening at times is the issue of class being kind of divided in discussions in terms of who can move or when you talk about legal victories being made, right? Like how in a real sense does it help someone in Trinidad, who lives, in communities that will never be able to kind of come to the city, right, in Port of Spain to experience kind of. So I guess my question is then, how do we kind of link, like how do we link legal victories that are made with the real lives of people who may never be able to kind of attain, I guess, being out. Like how we kind of think about being out in the West, right? But and this kind of using that as a way to kind of look towards the Caribbean as where people need to be out, right? And people we know that exist in many different ways, and there are many people who don't want to be out, right? And whether who are okay just living their lives the way they are. So how do we kind of link those two together, right?
That's a lot. I'll try and tackle the legal point. And you're very right. How do we make the decriminalization or any, repealing any laws that persecute our LGBT people, how do we make it relevant to persons from the lower socioeconomic strata, particularly? And my experience, as I've said to my friends from Rainbow Railroad, is that not everybody can flee. The majority, sadly, won't be able to qualify for a visa to come to Canada or to just about anywhere else. If you come from Jamaica, you need a visa to go to about everywhere. And you have to have so many assets, etc. So many of the people who are being oppressed can't get that. So for them, legal victories don't mean anything because they're talking about bread and butter issues. But what we have been trying to do in the work that I try and lead for the Legal Network is to link the legal cases with the other issues around changing hearts and minds. So, as I said, one of the things research from the University of Oxford has proven is visibility, and it's not rocket science, visibility helps liberty. The more people get to know LGBT people, the more they reject the religious doctrine that we're all pedophiles and freaks and blah, blah, blah. So that's important, but not everybody is comfortable being out. But for us to be visible, we need to have legal protections to do so. For example, one of the cases that I had to bring, the first case I brought actually wasn't an anti-sodomy law challenge. It was simply a challenge to the TV stations refusing to air an ad, 30-second ad, calling for respect for the rights of gays. Television stations said they can't air it because if they air it, it is endorsing an illegal activity. Right? When we wanted to do our first walk for tolerance back in 2009, which was all-inclusive with all oppressed groups walking together. Women, HIV positive individuals, you name it. The police lost my permit request 4 times because they said I was endorsing an illegal activity. So it all comes back to, sadly, this perception that we are unapprehended criminals. So before anything can happen, it's like you have to remove this logjam. As Jason saw, when that logjam was removed, no, Trinidad didn't automatically have marriage equality, but all of a sudden, people started to see potential. And that's not to say the other work that other people are doing, and I like to say, think of it in parallel. These all work together. Changing hearts and minds also involves changing the laws, because sometimes you have to get rid of the law so you can gain access to the spaces to help change the hearts and minds. And that will, I think, hopefully lead to, greater equality across the board.
So I'm going to touch on the coming out aspect. I'm going to start by saying our existence is resistance.
Yeah.
Right? And coming out is a choice. And depending on our borders, we make that choice. Depending on our socioeconomic status, we make that choice. Depending on our family, we make that choice. And oftentimes, it depends on our safety and our survival. And for those who are out, I always say that's a privilege to be out, living, thriving, and existing, and just loving who you are and be loved. But I also often think about those who are living pridefully in the shadows. And they are also out in their own ways. And we have to uplift that invisibility in the work that we do. And the borders, they're real, right? For the folks who can't be here today, that's real. For folks who want to sit in this room and hear us and be among community, but are afraid to walk through those doors because it means that they have to come out to themselves. And it means that they may see someone here that they know and they're outing themselves. Because allyship in our Caribbean community, it's not in solidarity. It's either you're gay or you're not. And it means that if you are with someone queer, you automatically associate that you're gay. And that narrative we have to shift. We have to shift that narrative in order for us to really build community and be safe in our own community. And with the work that I do with the Caribbean Equality Project and my team who's here, we say we're young organizers, but we organize based on the history and the legacy of everyone that came before us, that we're learning from as well. And more importantly, those that are in the Caribbean that are doing this work without our support, right? Most of us here had that choice to leave. Some folks don't. And they're still doing that work. They're still living defiantly and being queer in a country that views them as being illegal and criminals. And when I think of heroes, I think of everyone in the Caribbean that's visible. They are our heroes.
Just to follow from Mohamed, you're absolutely right, because I'll say quite frankly that my work in terms of queer diasporic work and queerness here is informed by the work of Afro and Indo-Caribbean feminists and, queer activists on the ground and in and also in different kinds of spaces. And I think it's important for us to understand that while that our work here is in support of the work that's there, and not the other way around. I think we have to be really clear, because the people there that are doing the work are very clear about what that work is and what needs to happen and how to do that work. So our work has to be in support of. I want to say something about the law, and this is why it is very important when victories happen. What does that mean for other groups? So we know that that what has happened with the law in Trinidad is that there was an amendment. It wasn't struck down completely. There was an amendment to the law, and that amendment was consent, right? Which means, how does that then juxtapose women who are sexually assaulted? And I think that's going to be a conversation that's going to happen for feminists and also for women who are raped. And I raise that question, and I raise that in a particular kind of way. What the law says is that consent, that it is now legal for those of the same sex and also of opposite sex, right, to have to be engaged in sexual and other kinds of intimacies, as long as it's consented to, as long as they're 16 years and over, right? So if consent is written into it. If someone is raped, a woman is raped, the only time that actually becomes prosecuted as rape is if it's vaginal. So what happens if she's raped anally? Then that does not fall under the rape legislation. And I'm saying that because I think even though this is a partial victory for us as queers, it also raises other issues that we need to think about, right? The fact that it wasn't struck down in its entirety is a problem. It should have been struck down like it was in Belize, in its entirety, that then says complete discrimination against same-sex is illegal. It doesn't say that. So therefore, discrimination against same-sex still continues in housing, in accommodation, in various spheres, right? So I think we have to be very clear about what the law says and the impact for us. So while it's a partial victory and we're happy that sexual intimacies between same-sex, sexual intimacy against opposites was always legal, but I'm not sure why I needed to say that. But, sexual intimacy between same-sex is now legal as long as there is consent, right? That's fine, but it raises other issues for us. So I think it's really important for us to think about intersections when we think about the law, and when we think about what other issues that raises, so that it allows us to start thinking about what next, where we have to work. And I'm telling you right now that I know that feminists are already thinking about what that means for the struggle. Because of the level of violence, sexual assault against women in the Caribbean, which is a real major issue. How do we then, what happens if a woman is raped anally? That is not seen as sexual assault, it's seen now as buggery, and that gets actually termed that way, and the way it's treated is very different to a sexual assault, right? So I'm raising that because of the complexity, but also of things that we have to think about in the law and how it locates various groups of people. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess drawing on the many points that have been made already, is I also want to acknowledge this concept of being out, for me, is a Eurocentric concept. Because if we're going to talk about being out, we need to be having this conversation in relation to the identities in the Caribbean, right? Where outness or being out, well, who constructs who is out and who is not? It's not us. these politics of being authentically queer are crafted by these white supremacist Eurocentric institutions, right? You know, and so I can share this story because I have permission, but when I was doing field work, I was talking to somebody who lived in Trinidad, and he told me that the first thing that happened when he came out to his mom is she attempted to commit suicide. That was the first thing he told me, and when he voiced that to me, I was like, this is why this whole discourse of being out and proud, I mean, we want to be proud, but proud by in our own way. Not the way that these white powers are telling us to be proud, that we have to wave our rainbow flag and, you know, do this and do that, right? The way that we need to perform our queerness should be a Caribbean queerness. And even in that, there are so many multiplicities, right? So, you know, I think we also need to acknowledge that the powers that are telling us how to be proud and how to be visible are constructed by white supremacy, that we need to dismantle in order to create our own way of, I don't even want to call it being out, whatever that futurity is of Caribbean queerness that we want to perform or engage in.
So in the last few minutes before I open it up to the floor, I wanted to ask to think about noting that with the laws changing or being challenged, how do we then kind of build alliances with other kinds of groups on the ground, knowing that that they are interconnected in terms of how it affects different women, and also taking up Jason Jones's kind of call to really think about who's included in these in terms of challenges or even to really say that it's still patriarchal in men that actually are in the forefront, right? So really, how do we build alliances? Like, what then does the future of a kind of a queer Caribbean kind of project across different spaces look like? So I mean, imagine possibilities.
That's a very important point, and for the liberation struggle to be sustainable, it has to include all the oppressed groups working together towards the same aim. The reality, though, and this is a sad reality, is that there are differences and very strong differences of opinion as to how the liberation project should be engaged in. And that can mean some groups are willing to go ahead, while some are not. And that's a very complicated discussion. But I do know that when we started, and I'm going to use only the example of Jamaica, which I know best. When we started doing the work in Jamaica, we wanted very earnestly to include the voices of lesbians, because we know that lesbians are particularly vulnerable, but because of the patriarchy, they're less likely to report. And so we had very graphic instances of women being violated, lesbians being raped and being sliced open by men who think that the reason they're lesbians is because they're too tight, and not going to the police to report or to the hospital. We had this, but they're not documenting, and the reason they're doing this is because they feel that they have to protect their families. They're caregivers. It's a societal that women are caregivers. So one of the things we did deliberately was we reached out and found a group called Quality of Citizenship Jamaica. That subsequently became defunct because then J-Flag extended their reach, and now they're doing more work around lesbians. And someone posted very recently, so what next after Decrim? What next? And I said, well, there's so much more we have to do. There's the work for the homeless youth. There's the work with poverty and class. It's like just the very beginning. I think that the idea of Decrim is that it opens the door to the possibility that we can challenge this oppressive, archaic, colonial, Victorian morality and law. And if that can fall, then what about other things? And I'll close by saying, in Jamaica, in 2012, we recently resaved 3 laws. The anti-sodomy law, the law against abortion, and the law against what they call obscene publication. So it shows that in the eyes of the moralists, all of these things are interlinked. So we have to think of them in this way. When we go after one, we have to go after all.
one of the things that I've learned at a very young age from my Guyanese parents is the importance of family. And for our queer community, family takes the form of, it takes many forms, right? Most of us actually choose our families, and families not always blood. For me personally, I feel like when we talk about community, we talk about bridging the gap, we have to also address the intersectionalities within the queer Caribbean communities. We have to talk about family, we have to talk about family abandonment, family rejection, family acceptance. We have to talk about our faith. We have to talk about those who have lost their faith and who's regaining it, right? We have to talk about this institution of marriage that so many folks actually want, right? And all of that is normalizing who we are. But we also have to continue to create spaces to have these conversations. And that's on the ground, in the Caribbean, in the diaspora, and then finding a way to bridge the gap. And we have only just begun to bridge that gap. There's still such a division among us. And one of the things that the organizer of this conference talked about was, how can we continue this narrative? How can we continue this narrative of bridging the gap among our queer Caribbean folks in the Caribbean region and in the diaspora? And it also starts with all of us, right? It starts with all of us to create these spaces to be. Breaking Silences just happens to be one of them. There's so many more that exist, right, that couldn't be here today, but it's happening. It's happening throughout the US, it's happening in Toronto, and it's happening in the Caribbean region. We just have to find a way to make sure that we get together. And for us right now, I'm even more grateful that this conference is happening, and we were able to have international queer Caribbean leaders in one space.
One of the things that that I actually admire and is really hopeful for me when I go to the Caribbean, and I do work with a number of groups who they call themselves lesbian, bisexual, and trans individuals, and they come from all over the Caribbean, and every year there's a conference where we get together. But one of the things that I noticed and what I observed in spending time in Trinidad and spending time in other places and seeing how queer activists organize is the fact that they do organize across the board, right? They don't actually stand in one space. So yes, they're queer, but they're also feminist. So they're also part of that movement. I mean, if we look at Life in Leggings, for instance, which actually started when there was this heightened attack on women, women's physical being, sexual assault around various festivals like Carnival and Crossover, etc. And those same women were also part of queer activism. And I'm saying that because what came to mind is the organizing of, queer women who also organized the Tambourine Army in Jamaica around sexual assault. So there is not, their activism is very intersectional. And I think that whenever something arises, that I sense that they are also thinking ahead of what the implications are for other groups. One of the major organizing coalitions that I've been seeing is with trans folks in the Caribbean. And I think people tend to kind of forget trans folks in the Caribbean, but they're actually amazingly organized. They are forceful, they are fearless, and they're everywhere, right, in the Caribbean. And we don't talk enough about our trans communities in the Caribbean, who are a driving force and who are pushing back at every angle, including those of us who identify as lesbians and gays, who think everything revolves around, lesbians and gays, forgetting that trans organizing has actually, in many, many ways, opened those spaces for those of us who identify as lesbians and gays in the Caribbean. So I want to actually thank those people in the Caribbean who have been, toiling at every end. Not only that, but also in terms of the neo-colonial project, right? On an everyday, because they too are also watching what's happening to them environmentally. Like, we got to make those connections because they have profound impacts for us on every level. So I just wanted to say that. Thanks.
Yeah, I guess we're kind of running out of time here, so I'll just kind of keep brief. But I guess also in terms of thinking about future projects, is that there's also kind of, this conference, there is an overrepresentation of the Anglophone Caribbean in this conference, but I think we also need to be in conversation with the French-speaking Caribbean and the Spanish-speaking Caribbean, because I feel like a lot of the time they're left out, and that's very frustrating, and we should be coming together in the region and in our diasporas, in the way our diasporas intersect with each other. So I just wanted to bring that to the forefront as well.
So now we're going to open it up to the floor. We have about 6 minutes to take a couple of questions for the panelists. So I think is there a mic? Yes, you can shout it out.
I can shout. Yeah. I wanted to thank the panel. It was really great, and really thank Beverly for laying out that geography of intersectional activism in the Caribbean. And on the question of trans activism, the really important case that we have not mentioned so far this morning is the cross-dressing case with the trans litigants from Guyana. And they were charged and locked up overnight and humiliated by the police, not just because they were trans, but because these are working class folk, right? So it's really important, because when we talk about these things, we often don't question our class privilege. And those folks, that decision is going to be handed down in December by the Caribbean Court of Justice, so it's really important. But inspired by Beverly's sort of take on this, my question was for Mohamed. I was really moved by what you said, and it's so wonderful that your mom is here. And I'm just wondering if you could say a bit more, for example, about the work you might do with a group like Jihadi Sisters, or what happens, I'm from Guyana, so what happens when Liberty Avenue or Quarantine Boulevard meets Flatbush and Church? How do we bring Black and Indo-Caribbean geographies together across the spaces of Brooklyn and Queens?
Well, I am so happy to hear Jihadi Sisters are being uplifted. We do a lot of work with Jihadi Sisters. A lot of it is done on the Indo-Caribbean aspect. The Caribbean Equality Project's work, a lot of our work focuses on bridging the Afro and Indo-Caribbean community in New York City. In regards to Jihadi Sisters, we recently partnered to uplift Stacey Singh, who was an Indo-Caribbean woman that was actually murdered by her husband. And then he actually committed suicide. And we realized from that incident, there's not enough conversation around mental health within our Indo-Caribbean community. And that can also be expanded to our Afro-Caribbean community as well. And for the first time, we saw an outpour of support for folks with mental health issues, but also like intimate partner and domestic violence in our communities we're not talking about. So working with the Jihadi Sisters, we are now currently creating spaces in Richmond Hill, where I live literally like 3 blocks away from Liberty Avenue. It's also 3 blocks away from where my family and I were attacked. And we understand, in terms of being visible and safety, one of the things that for me personally, I'm known as the gay guy. If I'm literally there, oh wait a minute, the gay guy's here, like we have to be in our P's and Q's, right? Because yeah, I'll call your shit out. Like if you're creating spaces for all of us to be, make sure it's welcoming and affirming for everyone. We're also working with folks in Brooklyn. We're currently doing this actually for Black Pride this year and for Brooklyn Pride this year. We created an LGBTQ Caribbean interfaith panel. And that was the first time that was done in Brooklyn. And we partnered with the Brooklyn Pride Center to make sure that happened. We had folks from Jamaica. Kenita from St. Lucia was actually there at the conversation. And it was around Pride. So when we celebrate Pride, we want to create spaces for also talk about our identity. And in those same spaces, talk about racism and anti-Blackness within our queer Caribbean community that oftentimes we don't talk about, that creates division and separation among who we are.
We can take about probably one more question, and then the dialogue is going to continue throughout the day. I see one person there.
I'll be opening a can of worms from a review at Discourse of Music History. talking about Stonewall and so on and so forth. I'm not going to mention Toronto 1982, which is our equivalent of Fuck You 52 Stonewall here in Toronto. But I want to talk more about HIV and AIDS and how it's segregated even within the LGBT racialized communities. And also things about immigration and policies and processes about coming to Canada when you test HIV positive in your testing coming here. Things like that. I know you can't answer it all, but I just want to bring HIV and AIDS to the conversation right off the bat since I didn't hear it mentioned this morning yet.
Well, I have to say that's a great segue to our next panel. It's a great segue to our next panel. We will be uplifting those identity issues in our communities as well. And yeah, that's a great way.
Yeah, so thank you so much for coming. So let's have the panelists, Maurice, Mohamed, Ryan, and Beverly today. All of you for being a part of this panel this morning. Thank you so much.